Chapter 1. The Architecture of Silence. There are children who demand attention, and there are children who learn early that attention is something to manage carefully. I became the second kind, not because I was bullied, not because I grew up in chaos. My childhood, from the outside, looked stable enough. School, family gatherings, expectations that were ordinary and familiar. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would justify the word survival. And yet I was always calculating. I noticed early that being loud meant being seen, and being seen meant being evaluated. Evaluation meant exposure. Exposure meant someone might discover something about me I hadn't figured out myself. So I chose control. At school, I spoke when necessary. I answered questions correctly, but never theatrically. I participated just enough to remain visible, but not enough to become a target of deeper curiosity. Teachers appreciated me. I followed instructions. I delivered results. I did not cause disruption. At home, I carried the same pattern: respectful, composed, measured. I learned which opinions were welcome and which were better left unsaid. I watched conversations carefully, sensing when silence was smarter than honesty. Stillness became a skill. People interpreted it as maturity. Adults used words like disciplined and wise for his age. I accepted those labels because they were safe. They required nothing from me beyond continued performance. What no one saw was the mental process behind that stillness. Before speaking, I evaluated impact. Before reacting, I evaluated consequences. Before expressing emotion, I evaluated risk. It wasn't fear in the dramatic sense. It was caution turned habitual. I studied people constantly. I observed how certain classmates commanded attention even without substance, how humor disarmed rooms, how confidence, real or fabricated, created authority. I noticed how anger could intimidate others into silence, and how charm could compensate for insecurity. I learned the mechanics of personality before I understood my own. But instead of experimenting outwardly, I internalized everything. I built what I later came to recognize as a psychological structure, a system designed to prevent exposure. The foundation was competence. If I performed well enough academically, behaved properly, and avoided unnecessary conflict, no one would question what was happening beneath the surface. Achievement became camouflage. When you perform consistently, people stop asking personal questions. Results distract from depth. Success insulates you from scrutiny, and insulation feels safe. But insulation also traps pressure. Inside that quiet exterior, something subtle was building. Not trauma. Not even sadness in a way I could name. It was more like distance, a slow separation between the person I experienced internally and the version I allowed others to know. I began optimizing perception before I developed identity. I learned to be impressive before I learned to be honest. I learned to be reliable before I learned to be authentic. Over time, this pattern stopped feeling intentional. It became automatic. I wasn't consciously hiding anymore. I was simply operating within a system I had built so early that I mistook it for personality. That system worked. It earned approval. It avoided confrontation. It minimized vulnerability. But it also created a quiet isolation. Because when you consistently filter yourself for acceptability, you stop exploring who you are outside of performance. You become efficient, but not necessarily connected. Capable, but not necessarily understood. Looking back, there was no single defining event that shaped this architecture. No dramatic fracture, just small repeated decisions to remain composed, to remain controlled, to remain unexamined. I rehearsed responses instead of expressing reactions. I curated impressions instead of forming relationships. And the most dangerous part was this: it felt normal. No one noticed the rehearsal. For years, neither did I. Chapter 2. The Performance Becomes a Pulse. By the time I entered university, silence was no longer a habit. It was infrastructure. I knew how to sit in a room without being examined. I knew how to speak just enough to be respected. I knew how to present intelligence without arrogance, confidence without threat. Years of quiet calibration had made social navigation feel mechanical. But structures require energy to maintain. And I was exhausted. University was supposed to be liberation. New campus, new classmates, new city rhythms. No one knew who I had been in school. No one expected consistency from me yet. I could introduce myself without carrying the weight of a pre-existing identity. For the first time, I had space. At first, I treated it like an experiment. I spoke more freely. I adjusted my tone depending on who I was with. Analytical with engineering students, humorous with the louder crowd, thoughtful with the introspective ones. I discovered how quickly personality could be modified when there was no historical record to contradict it. It felt powerful, not dishonest, adaptive. But adaptation has a cost. Every shift required awareness. Every interaction required calculation. Even reinvention, I realized, was performance in a different costume. The campus environment amplified everything. Conversations stretched late into the night. Cafes buzzed with ambition, insecurity, bravado. Students debated politics, careers, philosophy, often loudly, often passionately. I watched them express themselves without hesitation, without visible fear of miscalculation. I envied that ease. Inside, the same old monitoring system ran. How do I sound? Did that land well? Was that too much? Too little? The performance had evolved. It was no longer just silence. It was adaptability. I could be whoever the room needed. But I still didn't know who I was without the room. The first time I used anything stronger than caffeine, it wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic peer pressure, no reckless declaration of rebellion. It happened in a familiar social setting, laughter, shared stories, the casual passing of something that seemed harmless enough in the moment. I hesitated, but not out of moral conflict, out of curiosity. When the chemical warmth settled in, it wasn't euphoria that struck me. It was absence. The internal commentary paused, the constant scanning of environment softened, the pressure that had quietly built inside me for years, the need to regulate, to calibrate, to maintain structure, dissolved into something simple. Stillness. But this stillness felt different from the one I had built as a child. That one required vigilance. This one required nothing. For the first time in memory, I wasn't managing myself. I was just there. That feeling was intoxicating, long before any substance reached my bloodstream again. I told myself it was exploration, a rite of passage, university experimentation, a widening of experience. Everyone around me seemed to flirt with excess in one way or another. Late nights, intense debates, shifting identities, I framed it as expansion. But what I was really chasing was relief. Relief from being the architect of my own composure. Relief from constant self-awareness. Relief from earning worth through performance. Soon what had been occasional became patterned. The relief became anticipated. The anticipation became part of my weekly rhythm. I didn't spiral immediately. My grades didn't collapse overnight. My behavior didn't turn erratic in ways that alarmed anyone. From the outside, I was still functional. Inside, the exchange had already begun. The silence I once constructed deliberately, the disciplined, controlled quiet, was being replaced by a manufactured one. A quiet purchased rather than built. One demanded effort, the other demanded repetition. I didn't see the transaction clearly at first. I thought I'd discovered efficiency. Why spend years mastering emotional regulation when chemistry could provide instant equilibrium? Why exhaust myself maintaining internal order when something external could quiet the noise in minutes? I wasn't seeking destruction. I wasn't chasing chaos. I wasn't trying to rebel against family, culture, or expectation. I was trying to rest. But rest that depends on external input is never neutral. It carries interest. An interest compounds silently. What began as occasional relief became preference. Preference became habit. Habit became dependency disguised as lifestyle. The performance didn't disappear. It adapted again. Now, instead of performing composure through discipline, I performed stability through sedation. I showed up to lectures. I completed assignments. I maintained social presence. But the internal engine had changed. The pulse of my days began revolving around the next moment of quiet. The next pause. The next relief. University did not break me. It revealed how fragile my architecture truly was. Because once I learned there was a faster way to feel whole, the long path of discipline began to feel unnecessary. And I chose the shortcut. Not knowing shortcuts rarely end where you expect them to. Chapter 3. The First Crack. No confrontation, no intervention, no dramatic realization in front of a mirror. It was a Tuesday. I remember it clearly because nothing about it seemed important. The kind of weekday that blends into every other weekday. I had an early lecture, one I had specifically told myself I wouldn't miss. It was a subject I once cared about, a professor who respected punctuality, a class that required participation. My alarm rang. I opened my eyes. The room was already bright. Sunlight pressed harshly through the curtains, exposing the dust in the air. My head felt heavy, not painfully, just sluggish. My phone screen was lit with notifications, group chats, missed calls, a reminder about the lecture. For a few seconds I considered it. I could still make it. I could rush. I could throw on clothes, grab my bag, arrive late but present, apologize casually, re-enter the rhythm. That was the crossroads. Instead, I turned over. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even laziness in the way people imagine laziness. It was surrender to the easier option. I told myself I needed rest. That one absence wouldn't matter, that I'd catch up later. That decision, quiet, unremarkable, was the first real crack. Not the substances, not the late nights, not the experimenting. The crack was choosing disengagement over effort. Skipping once created a strange relief. I didn't have to perform, I didn't have to focus, I didn't have to maintain the image of competence. The world continued without me, and nothing catastrophic happened. So I skipped again. One class became two. A missed assignment became an extension request. An extension became silence. The professor who once nodded at me stopped looking in my direction. Emails went unanswered. Eventually, reminders stopped coming. The world adjusts quickly to your absence. What startled me most wasn't the external damage. It was the internal ease. I expected guilt to overwhelm me. I expected panic. Instead, I felt calm. If I didn't try, I couldn't fail. If I didn't show up, I couldn't disappoint anyone. If I withdrew first, I stayed in control. Intentional failure feels safer than accidental failure. At least it's on your terms. I began constructing small explanations to protect my pride. I'm just tired. It's just a phase. I'm managing it. I can fix this anytime. They weren't dramatic lies. They were soft ones, the kind that almost sound reasonable. I repeated them so often they started sounding true. But avoidance compounds the same way discipline does. The more I postponed responsibility, the heavier it became. My routine shifted. I started sleeping through mornings and staying awake deep into the night. The campus that once felt expansive began shrinking. I avoided certain corridors where I might run into professors. I muted group chats. I ignored invitations. It wasn't that I didn't care. Caring felt exhausting. Effort had weight now. Even small tasks felt disproportionate. Sending an email required emotional preparation. Attending a lecture felt like climbing something steep. And on nights when I wasn't intoxicated, when I was completely sober, the silence was louder than ever. I would sit alone, lights dim, staring at nothing specific, my laptop open but untouched. The city outside moving normally while I remained suspended in place. Those were the most honest moments. I would think, tomorrow I'll reset everything. Tomorrow I would wake early. Tomorrow I would apologize. Tomorrow I would catch up on assignments. Tomorrow I would re-enter the disciplined version of myself I once trusted. Tomorrow became a psychological refuge, a place where the better version of me still existed. But tomorrow required action, and when tomorrow arrived, it carried the weight of yesterday's avoidance. So I postponed again. The crack widened, not violently. From the outside, I was still articulate, still socially functional. I could hold conversations. I could joke. I could appear composed. Inside, though, the architecture had shifted. I was no longer building toward something. I was managing deterioration. Building requires vision. Avoiding collapse requires constant energy. Every skipped class added pressure. Every unanswered message tightened something inside me. I was expending more effort hiding decline than I would have spent maintaining discipline. But by then, the habit of retreat had taken hold, and once retreat feels safe, progress begins to feel threatening. That Tuesday didn't look like the beginning of anything significant, but it was, because it was the first time I chose absence over effort, and once you make that choice once, it becomes easier to make again. Chapter 4, The Weight of Small Things. It wasn't a dramatic downfall, it was erosion, the kind you don't notice until the edges of things begin to blur. The first losses weren't academic or financial. They were ordinary, small enough to dismiss, quiet enough to justify. I forgot a close friend's birthday, not because I didn't care. I had known the date for years. We used to joke about it. That year, the day passed unnoticed. When I finally saw the photos online, cake, laughter, tagged friends, I felt a brief sting. I typed out a message, deleted it, rewrote it, sent something casual. Sorry, been busy. Hope it was great. Busy was easier than honest. Another day, my mother called. I saw her name on the screen and let it ring, not out of anger, out of fatigue. I didn't have the energy to sound normal. Mothers can hear the difference in a voice. I didn't want questions I couldn't answer without lying. I texted instead. In class. Call you later. Later didn't come. Laundry piled up in the corner of my room. Dishes stacked near my desk. I wore the same shirt for days because washing it felt disproportionate to the reward. The smallest tasks began to feel like negotiations with gravity. Nothing catastrophic was happening. That was the dangerous part. I was still enrolled, still technically present, still capable of holding conversations when required. From the outside, my life hadn't collapsed, it had simply dulled. I began measuring success differently, not by progress, by containment. If I avoided a major mistake that day, I considered it a win. If I didn't create a new problem, I called it stability. My standards shifted downward. There were mornings I would sit on the edge of my bed and stare at the wall, not crying, not overwhelmed, just heavy, as if the air itself resisted movement. My body wasn't in pain, my mind wasn't screaming. It was a muted exhaustion that felt strangely physical. I told myself this was normal. Everyone procrastinates. Everyone avoids responsibility sometimes. Everyone feels unmotivated in university. I clung to that narrative. The difference, though, was preference. I began preferring numbness to engagement. Being slightly detached felt safer than being fully present. Presence required energy. Presence required authenticity. And authenticity meant someone might notice the inconsistency between who I was pretending to be and who I felt myself becoming. So I simplified my world. I declined invitations more often. I avoided long conversations. I kept responses short. When people assumed I was just busy, I didn't correct them. Busy was respectable. Busy implied productivity. Busy discouraged follow-up questions. The truth was less impressive. I wasn't building anything. I was preserving an image thin enough to pass inspection. The more I reduced my commitments, the smaller my world became. I avoided reflective surfaces, not literal mirrors, but situations that required self-assessment. I stopped planning ahead. Planning implied optimism. Optimism implied responsibility. Late at night, though, when the distractions faded, something else would surface. A flicker of panic. It came without warning. My heart would accelerate. My breathing would tighten. I would suddenly feel hyper-aware of time passing. A sharp thought would cut through the numbness. You're drifting. I would sit upright in bed, staring into darkness, feeling the weight of that realization. I would promise myself a reset. Tomorrow I would wake early. Tomorrow I would answer messages. Tomorrow I would fix the backlog. Tomorrow I would call my mother and sound sincere. In those moments the intention felt real, but morning diluted it. Sunlight entered the room. Notifications returned. The heaviness resumed its place at the edge of the bed. The urgency of the night softened into manageable avoidance. And I postponed again. The tragedy wasn't explosive. It was subtle. I functioned just well enough to avoid intervention. My grades hadn't completely collapsed. I hadn't been expelled. I hadn't lost every relationship. I was operating in a grey zone, degraded but still moving. That grey zone became dangerous, because postponement feels like control. It feels strategic. It feels temporary, until you realize you've been postponing your own reckoning for months. The small things kept accumulating. Missed birthdays, unreturned calls, unread emails, unfinished assignments, each one light enough to carry alone. Together heavy. And I carried them. Still smiling when required. Still articulating when necessary. Still performing competence in brief bursts. But inside, the architecture was no longer stable. It was under strain. And I was spending more energy pretending everything was fine than it would have taken to admit it wasn't. That's the weight of small things. They don't shatter your life. They slowly bend it out of alignment. Chapter 5. The Version of Me. I started feeding. There comes a stage when reaction shifts into arrangement. I stopped responding to circumstances and began organizing them. The intention was not improvement. The intention was concealment. This transition did not occur in a single moment. It developed, almost invisibly. I became attentive to social positioning. I calculated entrances and exits. I monitored posture, tone, duration of presence. I measured disclosure carefully, revealing enough to appear open while withholding anything that required vulnerability. I maintained steady eye contact. I timed laughter with precision. I offered polished contributions during discussions, statements refined enough to earn approval, yet brief enough to avoid deeper inquiry. I would withdraw before anyone could press further. Interaction became choreography. Among friends, I permitted limited openness. I spoke about manageable frustrations such as coursework stress or minor inconveniences. The deeper drift remained unmentioned. Within family settings, composure defined me. Speech became measured. Future plans were described confidently. Inconsistencies reframed as temporary recalibrations. Reassurance was delivered preemptively. Around unfamiliar individuals, sharpness emerged. Communication became efficient, controlled, slightly distant. I projected independence and emotional self-sufficiency. None of these identities were entirely artificial. Each represented a fragment of authenticity, yet no one encountered the complete structure. Compartmentalization became so refined that even I struggled to locate the core. By that stage, substances had shifted function. They were no longer experiments or symbols of rebellion. They became utilities. When social tension tightened my chest, chemistry softened it. When insomnia persisted, external sedation intervened. When confidence weakened, artificial amplification compensated. I described this behavior as calculated and functional. I convinced myself it remained contained. Visible collapse did not occur. Responsibilities were not entirely abandoned. Outward deterioration remained minimal. I framed the pattern as adjustment. Adjustment suggested intelligence and resilience. It implied strategic adaptation. Beneath those adjustments, however, erosion continued. Quiet moments grew uncomfortable. Subtle unfamiliarity replaced recognition. There was no dramatic crisis of identity, only distance. One evening, I passed a storefront and caught an unexpected reflection in the glass. The surface distorted slightly, yet posture and expression remained visible. The image displayed composure without vitality. The face appeared controlled but uninhabited. That realization unsettled me more than any tangible consequence. Consequences present measurable outcomes such as failed examinations, missed opportunities, or strained conversations. Internal detachment carries no immediate alarm. Gradually, I recognized that I was strengthening a particular identity. It required minimal accountability and avoided introspection. It favored shallow dialogue and environments that discouraged depth. Humor replaced sincerity because humor deflected examination. Convenience reinforced this version. Ease persuades effectively. It presents itself as manageable and sustainable. Long-term thinking diminished. 5-year projections seemed abstract. Former ambitions concerning trajectory and impact faded. Planning shortened into weekly survival. The objective became maintenance of appearance and avoidance of disruption. I labeled this transition as maturity. I described it as responsible stress management and efficient energy allocation. Privately, I understood the distinction between management and evasion. Management constructs. Evasion preserves. I was preserving an image while gradually diminishing beneath it. The most alarming realization was not damage, it was adaptation. Functioning while partially fractured felt possible. Human beings adjust rapidly. That adaptability serves survival, yet conceals decline. Exhaustion becomes normalized. Dishonesty becomes habitual. Disconnection becomes routine. Gradual change escapes detection. Collapse did not define that period. Erosion did. Each compromise appeared minor. Each concealment seemed justified. Each adjustment felt temporary. The efficient, detached identity strengthened with repetition. The quieter, candid self remained present yet undernourished. It did not protest. It waited. I could not determine how long authenticity could endure neglect without fading entirely. Chapter 6, The Night. Everything sounded honest. It was not the worst night. It was the clearest. That is why it stayed. There were no sirens, no ambulances, no one collapsing in a bathroom, no dramatic confrontation. If you had taken a photograph of that evening, it would have looked like every other university gathering. Dim apartment lights, music heavy enough to blur conversation, people dressed slightly better than usual to suggest effort without admitting it. It was someone's place near campus. Furniture pushed against the walls to make space. Bottles lined up on a kitchen counter like decorations. Windows cracked open just enough to let the smoke drift somewhere else. Everyone was performing something. Confidence, indifference, attraction, success. I walked in already rehearsed, relaxed posture, slight smile, controlled energy. I knew how to enter rooms by then, never too eager, never withdrawn, just balanced enough to appear self-contained. Someone greeted me loudly. Someone else handed me a drink before I asked. I accepted it automatically, not because I wanted it, but because declining would require explanation. The music was too loud for real conversation, which made everything easier. You could laugh without listening fully. You could nod without responding. At some point I laughed at something that wasn't funny. The kind of laugh that fills space rather than expresses joy. I remember thinking, that sounded convincing. For about 40 minutes, I felt invincible. That artificial expansion, the way confidence stretches unnaturally, can feel like liberation at first. My body loosened, my thoughts accelerated, words came easily, eye contact felt effortless. I moved through conversations like someone fluent in a language I didn't actually speak. But then it shifted. Not suddenly. The room didn't spin, it slowed. Conversations began stretching in strange ways. People's faces looked exaggerated under the dim lights, smiles slightly too wide, pupils slightly too focused. The bass from the speakers felt less like music and more like pressure. My heart started beating harder than the situation required. Not panic exactly, but insistence. Like it was trying to get my attention. I set my drink down, nodded at someone mid-sentence, walked toward the door casually, as if I just needed air. Outside, the night was colder than I expected. The street was almost empty. Streetlights buzzed faintly overhead. A car passed without slowing. The noise from inside the apartment was muffled now, reduced to a distant throb. I stood there and inhaled deeply. My hands were shaking slightly. I pretended I just needed a cigarette, though I didn't light one. I needed distance from the room, from the noise, from the version of myself I had just been embodying so confidently. For the first time, the confidence didn't feel empowering. It felt rented, like I had borrowed energy from somewhere unsustainable. And suddenly, the cost was visible. I felt like I had taken out a loan against my own nervous system. The rush had been immediate. The repayment was happening in real time. My chest tightened, my thoughts sharpened. There was a strange clarity to it. Not comforting clarity, but exposing clarity. Standing there under that streetlight, I realized something simple and destabilizing. I wasn't enjoying this anymore. Not the substances, not the gatherings, not the performance. I wasn't escaping anything either. I was maintaining a pattern, and I was maintaining it because stopping felt more complicated than continuing. Going back inside felt easier than admitting to myself that something had shifted. So I went back in. The apartment looked different now, almost theatrical. The laughter sounded exaggerated. The conversations felt rehearsed. I watched people move and thought, we all look like we're auditioning for something. Even my own voice sounded unfamiliar when I spoke. Detached, like it belonged to someone I was directing from a distance. But I kept playing along. Because admitting something is wrong creates responsibility. And responsibility requires courage. Courage to disappoint people. Courage to change habits. Courage to stand still while everyone else keeps moving. I didn't have that yet. Later that night, I returned to my room alone. The silence was not peaceful. It was loud in a different way. My chest still felt tight. My mind replayed the evening in fragments, the laughter, the exaggerated faces, the moment outside under the streetlight. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. The room was dark, but my thoughts were bright. And for the first time I allowed a question I had been avoiding. If this isn't freedom, then what am I doing? I had once framed everything as expansion, exploration, youth. But expansion doesn't feel like depletion afterward. Exploration doesn't leave you feeling counterfeit. There was no dramatic revelation, no vow to change. No sudden clarity about what the next step should be. Just awareness. A quiet recognition that something internal had crossed a line. Not legally, not publicly, not in a way anyone else could measure, but internally. There was now a gap between what I was doing and what I could defend. And once that gap forms, pretending becomes heavier. I didn't quit the next day. I didn't tell anyone I was struggling. I didn't alter my behavior immediately. But the fracture was there. And fractures, even invisible ones, eventually demand attention. Because once you realize you are moving against yourself, it becomes much harder to believe you are moving forward. Chapter 7. The phone call I didn't answer. Some turning points arrive. There was no argument, no raised voice, no visible fracture, only a phone lighting up on a desk in a dim room. Late afternoon was fading into evening. Curtains filtered weak light across the walls. A laptop sat open in front of me, displaying a document I had not meaningfully touched for hours. I had been simulating productivity, scrolling aimlessly, rereading lines without comprehension. The vibration began softly against the wood surface. I looked down without urgency. Then I recognized the name. It was not a casual acquaintance, not someone from a social gathering. It was someone whose care required no achievement in return. That kind of affection does not depend on performance. It only requires presence. The device continued to pulse. For a moment I considered answering. My hand even moved slightly. Then it stopped. The hesitation was not about schedule. It was not indifference. It was fatigue. Maintaining steadiness had become exhausting. Calibrating tone, selecting words carefully, ensuring my voice sounded composed had drained me. If I responded, I would need to sound stable, balanced, convincing. I did not trust myself to perform that version convincingly. Those who care deeply can hear what remains unsaid. They detect altered breathing patterns, flattened emotion, pauses before reassurance. I feared exposure through subtle shifts, so I remained still. The ringing ended, the screen darkened, silence returned, heavier than before. I assured myself it was temporary. I would respond shortly. After organizing my thoughts, after constructing a plausible explanation, excuses formed automatically. Each sounded reasonable, each required minimal elaboration. Time passed, minutes extended into an hour. The delay itself became justification for further delay. Calling too soon might invite questions. Calling too late might appear careless. Avoidance strengthens through postponement. Eventually, a brief message arrived requesting a return call when convenient. The tone contained no accusation, only openness. That gentleness intensified the discomfort. Anger would have provided defense. Frustration would have allowed counter-argument. Calm concern left no shield. I turned the phone face down. The following day I sent a concise reply explaining that the previous day had been busy. Busy suggested activity. It implied responsibility. It prevented deeper inquiry. The truth had been emptiness, yet emptiness invites conversation. Responses shortened after that. Frequency diminished. The effortless rhythm we once shared shifted into formality. Space expanded. I had engineered it. Dependency, not oracle. Sometimes it manifests as preference for isolation because isolation demands less accountability. Connection requires engagement. Engagement requires sincerity. Sincerity would have required admitting instability. I was not prepared to articulate that. Instead, I framed my withdrawal as protection. I convinced myself I was sparing others from concern. I imagined reconnecting once improvement occurred. In reality, I was shielding myself from scrutiny. Honest dialogue might have prompted questions. Questions might have encouraged assistance. Assistance would have required vulnerability. Clear visibility felt threatening. There exists a specific solitude that arises when distance is self-constructed. Responsibility cannot be transferred. That evening, I scrolled through older photographs. Earlier versions of myself appeared unguarded, standing beside individuals I had gradually avoided. Smiles seemed natural rather than rehearsed. I attempted to locate the precise moment of divergence. No singular rupture emerged, only accumulation. Incremental withdrawal layered over time. There was no dramatic breakdown, no visible collapse, only recognition. The pattern had become intentional. Repeated behavior shapes identity. Consistent silence cultivates withdrawal. Continuous evasion solidifies concealment. Awareness surfaced, yet action did not follow. I placed the phone aside and lay down. I assured myself that morning would bring correction. I would initiate contact. I would restore equilibrium. Dawn arrived predictably. Weight returned with it. Intention remained present. Execution did not. That is how separation hardens. Not through conflict, through unanswered signals, through rehearsed explanations, through mornings when resolve dissolves before becoming speech. Chapter 8, when the mirror started talking back. It happened in a bathroom I can't place on a map. Not my apartment, not my family home. Just another temporary space, someone else's tiles, someone else's soap by the sink, someone else's towel hanging unevenly on the wall. The lighting was unforgiving, fluorescent, slightly too bright. I remember closing the door behind me and leaning both hands on the edge of the sink. The music from the other room was muffled through the wall. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Water dripped faintly from a faucet that hadn't been fully tightened. I turned the tap on and let the water run over my hands. Then I looked up. For a second, brief but sharp, I didn't recognize the expression staring back. It wasn't dramatic deterioration. My face wasn't hollow. My eyes weren't bloodshot beyond what could be explained away. If someone else had looked at me, they would have seen a normal young man washing his face in a bathroom. But I saw something different. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. A kind of emotional jet lag. Like I had been traveling between versions of myself so often that I no longer knew which time zone I belonged to. I leaned closer to the mirror. I studied my own eyes the way you study a stranger on public transport, curious, slightly detached, trying to understand what story they carry. There was calculation there. I could see it clearly now. The subtle tightening around the mouth, the alertness behind the gaze, and beneath that, defensiveness. Even alone, I was bracing. That realization unsettled me more than anything. Why was I bracing in an empty bathroom? From what? The answer surfaced quietly. From myself. I had started negotiating with myself daily. Just get through today. Just don't make it worse. Just hold it together. The language had shifted. There was a time I measured myself by ambition, by growth, by achievement. I used to think in terms of building, skills, knowledge, plans, momentum. Now I thought in terms of containment. Minimize damage, avoid exposure, maintain the surface. When did my standards shrink to survival? The mirror didn't accuse me, it didn't shame me. It simply reflected what I had been carefully avoiding. I was exhausted from managing two realities. The public one was intact, competent, steady, articulate, disciplined enough to pass. The private one was fragmented, scattered thoughts, low-grade anxiety, irritability that surfaced in small, unexplainable ways. A constant background hum of unease. Maintaining both required energy I didn't have. I splashed water on my face as if the cold might reset something deeper than skin. Droplets ran down my jawline. I grabbed a paper towel and wiped carefully. Then, instinctively, I straightened my posture, even alone. Chin slightly raised, shoulders back. Expression neutral. Repair the exterior first. It had become automatic. I left the bathroom and re-entered the room I had stepped away from. Conversation resumed around me. Someone asked where I'd been. I made a joke. It landed. People laughed. But the image in the mirror lingered in my mind. Later that night, back in my own room, the distraction techniques didn't work. I tried noise, music low in the background. It felt intrusive. I tried scrolling. Every image felt distant, irrelevant. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, the earlier reflection replaying in my head. An uncomfortable awareness began rising in my chest. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was thinning out. Becoming, even when painful, expands you. It stretches your identity, tests your limits, introduces growth. Thinning reduces you, quietly, gradually. It strips away substance while leaving the outline intact. From the outside, I still looked like myself. Inside, I felt less dense, less grounded. I tried to remember the last time I had felt proud of something that had nothing to do with perception, nothing to do with appearing capable, nothing to do with convincing others I was fine. I couldn't find a recent example. That absence scared me. Not because of reputation, not because of grades, not because of consequences, but because self-respect had started eroding. And when you stop respecting yourself, even slightly, the world feels less stable. Not because it changes, because you no longer trust the person navigating it. You begin questioning your own decisions, your own motives, your own consistency. Lying in that dark room, I felt something settle into clarity. I had been blaming circumstances, stress, university pressure, social expectations, temporary confusion, but none of those explanations fully accounted for what I saw in the mirror. I was participating in my own erosion, not maliciously, incrementally, choosing avoidance over honesty, choosing sedation over presence, choosing performance over integration. Participation implies responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than guilt. Guilt can be externalized, it can be rationalized, it can be postponed. Responsibility stays, it doesn't shout. It sits quietly in your chest and waits for you to acknowledge it. That night, I didn't make a dramatic promise. I didn't swear to change everything. I didn't confess to anyone. But something shifted. For the first time, I stopped seeing myself as a victim of drift. I saw myself as a contributor to it. And that truth, clear, undramatic, undeniable, felt heavier than any external consequence I had faced so far. Chapter 9. The day I couldn't fake it. There are days when the mask slips slightly, just enough for you to notice, not enough for anyone else to comment. And then there are days when it refuses to stay on at all. This was the second kind. It was a normal work day. Nothing dramatic about the calendar. A scheduled meeting in a conference room that looked like every other conference room, glass walls, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, a long table polished to reflect seriousness. There were printed documents in front of me, a laptop open, a bottle of water positioned neatly near my hand. I had prepared for this. I knew the talking points. I had rehearsed key phrases in my head on the drive there. Deadlines, deliverables, alignment, strategy, the vocabulary of competence. Someone was speaking about timelines. Another person added something about risk mitigation. Heads nodded in agreement. Pens tapped lightly against notepads. When it was my turn to speak, I leaned forward slightly, just as I always did. Measured posture, controlled tone. I began outlining the structure of the proposal. Clear milestones, financial projections, technical considerations. The words came out organized, logical, precise. Halfway through a sentence, something shifted. My voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble. It thinned, as if the substance behind it had quietly drained. I heard myself speaking, but it felt like I was listening to a recording of someone else. The sentences were polished. The points were sharp, but there was no internal connection to them. It was like watching my own mouth move from a distance. A strange sensation crept into my chest. Not panic, not anxiety. Exposure. Not exposure of mistakes. Exposure of emptiness. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought everyone in the room could see it, that they could detect the detachment behind my words, that they would pause and ask, "Are you okay?" No one did. They nodded. They took notes. Someone even said, "That's very clear." The meeting continued. I finished my part, closed my laptop, shook hands. Someone complimented my clarity on the way out. That almost made it worse. Because if I could perform that convincingly while feeling hollow, how long had this split been operating? How many meetings? How many conversations? How many moments had I inhabited only partially? I walked to my car in the parking lot. The sun was bright, almost aggressive. The air felt heavier than usual. I got in, closed the door, and didn't start the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I stared through the windshield at nothing in particular. Traffic moved in the distance. People crossed the street. A car alarm chirped somewhere. Life was functioning normally. Inside, something had stalled. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't intoxicated. I wasn't crashing from anything. I was simply tired. Tired of dividing myself. The competent version, the one who could analyze, structure, deliver, was strong, reliable, trusted. The hidden version, the one quietly drifting, emotionally fragmented, was growing louder. They were no longer aligned. They were pulling in opposite directions, and holding that tension felt like gripping a rope that was beginning to fray in my hands. Up until that point, my primary question had always been tactical. How do I manage this? How do I balance it? How do I prevent exposure? Sitting in that car, the question shifted. Who am I becoming if this continues? The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a headline. It was subtle and unsettling. A man who avoids depth, a man who performs stability, a man who looks capable but feels disconnected. A man who gradually loses access to his own interior world. That possibility frightened me more than financial loss, more than professional failure, more than disappointing anyone in that meeting room, because it suggested something long-term. Emotional absence, practiced repeatedly, becomes default. If you rehearse detachment long enough, it hardens. It becomes personality. I imagined years passing like this, me sitting in meetings, speaking fluently, achieving externally, while internally thinning further. That image felt heavier than any immediate consequence. I started the car eventually. I drove home without turning on music. No podcasts, no calls, just the sound of the engine and my own breathing. The city looked ordinary through the windshield. Buildings, traffic lights, pedestrians carrying groceries. Nothing had changed externally. But something internal had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to sustain the split. I was thinking about its cost. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to wait for a dramatic collapse to justify change. Because collapse would come eventually, not as spectacle, as exhaustion. And I was already closer to that edge than I had been willing to admit. Chapter 10. The conversation I had with the floor. No broken glass, no shouting, no music swelling in the background. Just 17 a.m., glowing faintly from the corner of my phone screen. The apartment was quiet in that late-night way that feels almost confrontational, not peaceful, exposed. The kind of silence where even the hum of the refrigerator sounds amplified, where every small shift of fabric or breath feels louder than it should. I don't remember deciding to sit on the floor. I remember standing near the wall, then sliding down it, my back dragging against the paint until I reached the baseboard. It felt mechanical, as if gravity had more authority than I did. I sat there with my legs stretched out in front of me, palms resting flat against the cool tile. There's something honest about floors. You don't sit on one unless something inside you is too tired to remain upright. Floors don't allow posture. They don't allow presentation. They strip away the illusion of control. The ceiling felt far away. The room felt smaller than usual. My furniture looked unfamiliar, like props in a space I had been renting from myself. I stared at nothing specific. A faint crack in the opposite wall, a shadow cast by the streetlight outside. My breathing felt loud. For the first time in a long time, I stopped negotiating. No internal contracts. No strategic promises. No tomorrow I'll fix this. Just stillness. How often I had been bargaining with myself. Just get through this week. Just stabilize a little. Just don't let it get worse. But sitting there, bargaining felt dishonest. So I said something out loud. What are you doing? Not angrily, not dramatically, just tired. The words landed in the room and dissolved into silence. No echo, no response. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument I'd ever had with another person. Because in an empty room, excuses sound thin. There was no one to convince, no one to impress, no one to mislead. I wasn't a victim of circumstances. I wasn't misunderstood. I wasn't uniquely burdened. I was exhausted from maintaining something unsustainable. My hands were shaking slightly, not from substances, not from panic, from clarity. Clarity is not comforting. It strips away your preferred narratives. It removes the flattering explanations. It forces you to see the pattern without the decoration. For years, I'd framed my behavior generously. I'm adapting. I'm navigating pressure. I'm experimenting. I'm evolving. But sitting on that cold floor, none of those sentences held weight. The truth was simpler. I was running. Not from responsibility, from myself, from the version of me that demanded alignment, from the voice that asked uncomfortable questions, from the part of me that remembered who I once intended to be. And the worst part? I had become efficient at running. I structured my days around distraction. I scheduled my life around performance. I built routines that allowed me to avoid long stretches of silence. Because stillness is confrontational. Stillness shows you the gap between who you claim to be and how you're actually living. I looked around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time, dust lining the baseboards, a cup left on the table from earlier, the faint mechanical hum of appliances doing their job without complaint. Everything was functioning, except me. I hadn't allowed myself uninterrupted stillness in months. Every quiet moment had been filled. Music, scrolling, background noise, anything to blur the edges of my own thoughts. But now there was nothing to buffer it. No music, no conversation, no chemical softness. Just me and the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. There was no dramatic release, just sustained acknowledgement. I stayed there longer than I wanted to, longer than was comfortable. Long enough for the urge to distract myself to rise and fade without being acted on. And somewhere in that stretch of silence, a fragile thought formed. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm weak. Maybe the problem is that I'm afraid to stop. Because stopping means feeling everything I've postponed, every ignored call, every compromised value, every diluted version of myself. Stopping would require sitting with it all. The floor didn't offer advice, it didn't provide resolution, but it held me. And in that holding, something subtle happened. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't moving, externally or internally. Not from exhaustion, from acknowledgement. It wasn't recovery, it wasn't redemption, it wasn't even decision, it was recognition. A quiet admission that the life I was maintaining was misaligned with the person I still hoped to become. And recognition, however uncomfortable, is the first honest step toward change, whether you feel ready for it or not. Chapter 11. The morning after nothing changed, I expected something to feel different. After sitting on the floor at 2:17 a.m., after speaking honestly into an empty room, after allowing clarity to strip away my favorite excuses, I assumed I would wake up altered in some visible way. Lighter, decisive, reset. Instead, morning arrived exactly on schedule. Sunlight pushed through the thin gap in the curtains, cutting a pale line across the wall. My phone alarm vibrated against the bedside table. My mouth felt dry. My body felt heavy in the same familiar way. For a few seconds, I lay still, waiting for the transformation to register. Nothing. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. My phone lit up with notifications, emails, messages, reminders. The world had continued without interruption. That almost discouraged me more than collapse would have. If everything still looked normal, then maybe the night hadn't mattered. I got up slowly and walked to the bathroom. The mirror met me again, less harsh in the daylight. I wasn't searching for revelation this time. I wasn't trying to decode my expression. I just observed. My body moved through routine automatically, turning on the tap, reaching for the toothbrush, squeezing toothpaste with the same muscle memory I had used for years. It struck me how mechanical it felt. My hands moved without consulting intention. My face held a neutral expression without instruction. I was functioning on habit. Insight doesn't equal action. You can understand yourself with uncomfortable precision and still repeat the same behaviors by noon. Awareness does not override momentum. I made coffee and sat at the small table in my apartment. The chair across from me was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by the version of me I had been gradually becoming. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't reckless in obvious ways. He was efficient, defensive, controlled, slightly detached. He had adapted well, and he had grown comfortable. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and realized something more unsettling than the previous night's clarity. I had been waiting for catastrophe to justify change, a public failure that would force accountability, a medical scare that would shock me into urgency, a professional collapse that would strip away illusion, something loud enough to make the decision for me. But what if no catastrophe came? What if I simply continued like this? Functional, competent, gradually thinning. The idea of slow erosion frightened me more than rock bottom. Rock bottom is obvious. It demands intervention. It attracts attention. It forces a narrative shift. Slow erosion doesn't. It hides inside functionality. It allows you to keep earning, keep attending meetings, keep answering calls while losing something harder to measure. Aliveness. I didn't stand up and declare anything dramatic that morning. I didn't delete contacts. I didn't draft confessions. I didn't promise myself a clean break from everything that had complicated my life. I did something smaller. I stayed with the discomfort. The urge to distract myself rose quickly. I wanted music, a podcast, something to drown out the uneasy awareness lingering in my chest. Instead, I let it sit. It felt unfamiliar, like hosting a guest I had avoided for years. Not hostile, not violent, just present. I expected it to overwhelm me. It didn't. It was uncomfortable, yes, tight in the chest, slightly restless in the body, but survivable. That realization shifted something subtle. Maybe I had been anesthetizing feelings that were never fatal. Maybe I had mistaken discomfort for danger. The night before, I had feared that stopping would unravel me, that sitting with clarity would break something irreparably. But here I was, drinking coffee, breathing, existing, uncomfortable but intact. Maybe I wasn't as fragile as I had believed. Maybe I had underestimated my capacity to endure reality without numbing it. The day unfolded as it normally would. I attended what I needed to attend. I responded to what required response. I spoke when necessary. I completed tasks. Externally, nothing about me looked different. Internally, though, there was a quiet shift. I was no longer pretending I didn't see the gap between who I was presenting and who I was living as. I had seen it clearly the night before. And once you see a gap like that, you can't return fully to blindness. You can ignore it. You can postpone addressing it, but you can't unknow it. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No breakthrough conversation, no sudden surge of discipline, no immediate transformation. And that, I began to understand, was the point. Change might not arrive like thunder. It might begin like this, quiet, Inconvenient, deeply personal. A decision not to look away. A willingness to sit with discomfort a few minutes longer than yesterday. A refusal to wait for catastrophe as permission to evolve. That morning didn't fix me, but it did something more foundational. It removed the illusion that I was unaware. An awareness once sustained is difficult to escape. Chapter 12, The Appointment. I booked it before I could negotiate with myself. I had the number saved for 3 days. Opened the website twice. Closed it twice. Read the therapist's short bio, calm, professional, degrees listed in neat bullet points. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed urgency, that almost gave me permission to delay. You don't need this, I told myself. You're functional, you're just stressed. But that afternoon, sitting at my desk with the familiar heaviness hovering in my chest, I opened the booking page again. Available times. Wednesday, 3 p.m. My thumb hovered over the confirmation button longer than necessary. I could feel the old reflex rising. Postpone, minimize, rationalize. Instead, I pressed it. The screen refreshed. Appointment scheduled. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. Official, polite, neutral. It felt absurdly formal for something so personal. I almost cancelled twice before the day came. The first time was the next morning. I reread the email and felt embarrassed by my own decisiveness. It seemed excessive. I imagined sitting across from someone and not knowing what to say. I imagined sounding dramatic. The second time was an hour before I was supposed to leave. I told myself other people had real problems, visible breakdowns, severe crises. Mine felt abstract, manageable, quiet. But I went. The building was ordinary. Beige exterior, glass door with a small directory posted beside it. No dramatic signage, no visible declaration of emotional urgency. Inside, the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and artificial lavender. The combination was strangely clinical and comforting at the same time. A small table held outdated magazines. A clock ticked louder than it needed to. 2 other people were sitting there. They looked normal. One scrolling on a phone. One flipping through a magazine. No visible distress. No visible chaos. That unsettled me. If they looked fine, then what did that mean about the threshold for being there? I sat down and focused on the floor tiles. Clean, patterned, predictable. I avoided eye contact, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to acknowledge we were all there for something invisible. When my name was called, I stood up automatically, like I was being summoned for evaluation. The office was smaller than I had imagined. A couch, a single armchair, a window half open, letting in muted city noise. A bookshelf lined with titles about trauma, attachment, cognition. The therapist was calm, neutral, not overly warm, not cold. Her voice didn't carry urgency. That steadiness felt grounding. She gestured toward the couch. I sat. There was a brief silence, not awkward, just open. Then she asked gently, "Why are you here?" I had prepared something polished, a structured explanation, a summary of stress, a rational, well-articulated overview of patterns. Instead, what came out was simpler. "I'm tired." The word hung in the air. She didn't interrupt. Not tired of work, not tired of people, tired of pretending, I added. The sentence surprised me. It felt both accurate and incomplete, like I had just opened a door but hadn't stepped through it. She nodded slightly, not dramatically. "What does pretending look like for you?" she asked. That question forced me inward. I described the split, the competent exterior, the private disconnection, the constant calibration, the fatigue of managing perception. I didn't confess everything. I didn't list every behavior. I didn't unravel. But I also didn't perform. For 50 minutes, I didn't have to optimize my personality. I didn't have to sound impressive. I didn't have to protect an image. I could pause mid-sentence. I could say, "I don't know." At one point, she asked something that landed deeper than the rest. "When did you start carrying everything alone?" I didn't have a date. No dramatic event came to mind, but I had a sensation. Somewhere along the way, I had equated strength with silence, competence with self-containment. I had internalized the idea that if I could manage everything privately, I would remain admirable. Asking for help felt like weakness, or worse, exposure. Saying that out loud felt like loosening armor I had been wearing for years, armor that once protected me but had grown heavy. She didn't diagnose me immediately. She didn't assign a label within the first session. She listened, reflected, asked small, precise questions. The simplicity of it disarmed me. There was no dramatic breakthrough, No tears, no sudden revelation, just clarity shared aloud. When the session ended, I expected to feel embarrassed walking out, as if the receptionist would somehow know what I had said. Instead, I felt something cleaner, exposed, but not in a humiliating way. More like opening windows in a room that had been closed too long. The air wasn't perfect, it wasn't fragrant, but it was moving. The waiting room looked the same as before. The same clock ticking, the same magazines, but I felt slightly different walking through it. On the drive home, I noticed the quiet in the car. Not oppressive, not tense, just quiet. I didn't reach for music immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't replay every word in self-criticism. I just drove. Nothing in my external life had changed. My responsibilities were still there. My habits hadn't vanished. My patterns were still intact. But something fundamental had shifted. I had interrupted the isolation. Not dramatically, just deliberately. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like something I needed to escape. Chapter 13, Withdrawal, without drama. I wish I could say I woke up one morning, drew a line in the sand, and never crossed. That would make for a cleaner story. But there wasn't a clean break. There was reduction, there was hesitation, there was bargaining. Some days I followed through on the decisions I had made in therapy and alone on the floor at 2:17 a.m. Other nights, old habits hovered close enough to feel reasonable again. Withdrawal, at least for me, wasn't cinematic. No shaking in hospital beds, no public declarations, no dramatic collapse in front of witnesses. It was quieter than that. It was irritability that didn't match the situation. Someone would ask a simple question, and I would feel an unreasonable surge of frustration beneath my calm response. It was sleep that refused to cooperate. I would lie in bed, eyes closed, body tired, mind alert in uncomfortable ways. No chemical shortcut to soften the edges, just awareness. It was a body that felt slightly out of sync with itself, like my nervous system had forgotten how to regulate without assistance. I started noticing how often I had relied on external stimulation to manage internal discomfort. Anxiety? Soften it. Restlessness? Distract it. Loneliness? Mute it. Now there was no buffer. Coffee tasted sharper, almost aggressive. Conversations felt slower, less artificially enhanced. Silence stretched longer than I was used to tolerating. My nervous system had to relearn how to exist without shortcuts. That recalibration felt awkward. Like walking without a limp you didn't realize you had. At first, you overcompensate. You move stiffly. You're hyper-aware of every step. I became aware of how much of my previous balance had been engineered. Now I was meeting myself without edits. There were moments I resented the decision to change. Late evenings were the hardest. The time of day when old rhythms used to take over automatically. I would feel a familiar pull, not loud, not desperate, just persuasive. You were functional. You handled your responsibilities. You weren't spiraling. You're overcorrecting. The mind is skilled at romanticizing what is familiar. It doesn't remind you of the cost. It highlights the convenience, and convenience is seductive. But something fundamental had shifted in me. I no longer wanted to feel artificially balanced. I wanted to know what baseline actually felt like. And baseline, it turns out, is not euphoric. It's ordinary. Ordinary mornings where nothing dramatic happens. Ordinary moods that fluctuate slightly without extreme highs or lows. Ordinary fatigue at the end of a long day. At first, ordinary felt disappointing. Where was the surge of energy? Where was the amplified confidence? Where was the intensity? But ordinary began to feel stable, and stability began to feel powerful. I started noticing small things returning, not dramatically, not all at once. Patience during conversations, the ability to listen without scanning for escape routes, clearer thinking in meetings, not sharper because of stimulation, but steadier because my mind wasn't fragmented. The ability to sit in a quiet room without immediately reaching for distraction. These weren't grand victories. No one congratulated me for them. They were recalibrations. There were still restless nights. I would pace slowly across the apartment, drink water, stand by the window and watch the street below. Breathe in through my nose, out through my mouth, counting. Nothing heroic, just enduring. Endurance became its own practice. And through endurance, something unfamiliar began forming. Self-trust, not confidence. Confidence is loud. It seeks validation, not pride. Pride looks outward. Trust is quieter. Trust that I could feel discomfort without collapsing. Trust that impulses, no matter how convincing, were temporary. Trust that the version of me choosing differently wasn't weak or naive. He was learning. Recovery, at least in this stage, didn't feel triumphant. There were no victory speeches in the mirror. It felt disciplined, structured, deliberate. And discipline, I began to understand, is a quieter form of self-respect. Not glamorous, but foundational. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to escape myself. I was learning how to stay. Chapter 14. The first honest conversation. It wasn't planned. There was no dramatic build-up, no text that said, "We need to talk," no night of rehearsing what I would confess and how I would frame it. It was just coffee. Late afternoon, a place we had both been to before, wooden tables, soft indie music playing low enough to ignore, the smell of roasted beans thick in the air, sunlight filtered through tall windows, cutting the room into warm sections of gold and shadow. She had known me before things shifted. Before the calculated distance, before the rehearsed composure, before the subtle drift that even I pretended not to notice. When she hugged me hello, it lasted a second longer than usual. Not suspicious, just measuring. We sat down, ordered, smiled the way people do when they're reacquainting themselves with a familiar rhythm. The conversation started safe. Work updates, a mutual friend who had gotten engaged, traffic complaints. I was good at this part. Measured responses, light humor, controlled tone. I maintained eye contact without overcommitting. I asked questions back at the right intervals. It was social choreography, and I had mastered it. But I could feel it, beneath the surface. The tension of maintenance. Halfway through describing something about a project, she stopped nodding and just looked at me. Not at my hands, not at my phone. At me. You've been different. The sentence landed, but it echoed. Different. Not what's wrong with you. Not you've changed for the worse. Just an observation. My body reacted before my mind did. A subtle tightening in my chest, a flicker of heat behind my eyes, the reflex to pivot. The old scripts assembled quickly. Yeah, just busy. Work's been intense. You know how it is. I could hear the casual tone I would use, the dismissive half-smile, the gentle redirection. For a second, I considered it. Then something in me hesitated. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the therapist's question still echoing in my head. When did you start carrying everything alone? Maybe it was the quiet discipline I had been trying to build. I know, I said. It felt like stepping onto unstable ground. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fill the silence. I stared at the rim of my coffee cup. The steam rising between us felt oddly symbolic, visible, fleeting, impossible to hold. I wasn't doing well, I added. The words sounded smaller than the truth, but they were real. No performance, no dramatic backstory, no details about substances, isolation, or sleepless nights, just acknowledgement. She didn't react the way I had secretly feared. No widened eyes, no lecture, no immediate demand for explanation. She just exhaled. I figured, she said. That sentence cracked something open. All that time I thought I was hiding it perfectly. All that effort invested in managing tone, posture, availability. I believed I was protecting people from the instability beneath the surface, but she had seen it anyway. Not the specifics, the shift, the dimming. And she hadn't walked away. I felt exposed, but not attacked. Seen, but not diminished. There was relief in that. Relief in not having to continue the act for the next hour. Relief in not calculating every response. Relief in allowing the version of me sitting there to be incomplete. "How are you now?" she asked. The question wasn't clinical. It was human. "Better," I said. And this time it wasn't strategic reassurance. It was cautious honesty. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't fully stable. But I wasn't spiraling quietly anymore. We didn't turn the conversation into a confessional. She didn't pry. I didn't overshare. We moved forward gently, talked about ordinary things again, career plans, family updates, travel ideas, but something had shifted beneath the surface. I wasn't speaking from behind reinforced glass. My shoulders felt less rigid, my breathing steadier. I wasn't scanning for judgment in her expressions. There was space at the table now, space that hadn't been there before. At one point she said, almost casually, "You don't have to handle everything alone, you know?" The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even emphasized. But it lingered. How deeply I had equated self-sufficiency with value. How I believed competence meant containment. That if I could manage my deterioration privately, I would remain admirable. Asking for help had felt like surrender. But this This wasn't surrender, it was alignment. On the walk back to my car, the city felt strangely sharper, the air cooler against my skin. I noticed sounds I usually filtered out: distant traffic, footsteps on pavement, someone laughing across the street. How much fear had governed my silence. Fear of being perceived as weak, fear of disappointing people who respected me, fear that once someone saw the crack, they would define me by it. Yet vulnerability hadn't cost me anything that afternoon. It hadn't reduced me. It hadn't dismantled my credibility. It had created space. There's a difference between being exposed and being honest. Exposure feels involuntary, like something has been torn open. Honesty is chosen, it's controlled, it's intentional. I had chosen it. That distinction changed something subtle inside me. The conversation didn't magically repair the months of distance between us. It didn't rewrite missed calls or silent periods, but it marked something fundamental. I had allowed myself to be seen without collapsing. No catastrophe followed, no rejection, no dramatic consequence, just continuity. And that continuity rewired something in me. Connection wasn't the threat. Pretending was. Driving home, I didn't replay the conversation in obsessive detail like I usually did. I didn't critique my phrasing or wish I had said less or more. There was nothing to edit, nothing to conceal, nothing to polish. For the first time in a long while, I had spoken without architecture, and I was still standing. Chapter 15. The Return of Desire. It didn't arrive like ambition. There was no sudden surge of motivation, no dramatic moment where I woke up at dawn with a 5-year plan and a renewed hunger for conquest. It arrived as curiosity. I was at my desk on an ordinary afternoon, working through something routine, a document that needed refining, the kind of task I could complete on autopilot. For months, autopilot had been enough. Finish it, submit it, move on. But that day, halfway through a paragraph, I paused. Not because I was tired, because I wanted it better. I reread a sentence that was technically fine, clear enough, acceptable. No one would question it. Most people wouldn't even notice it. Still, I adjusted it, shifted a phrase, tightened the structure, removed a word that felt slightly lazy. Then I kept going. I refined a section that didn't require refinement. I reorganized an argument that already worked. I stayed with the task longer than necessary, not out of fear of criticism, not to impress anyone, out of interest. That startled me. For a long time, my energy had been defensive. Avoid consequences, maintain image, keep balance, don't collapse. Everything I did had a protective edge to it. Even competence was armor. But this felt different. This felt like forward movement. There's a difference between doing something so you won't fail and doing something because you care. I hadn't felt the second one in a while. Desire, when it returns after a long absence, doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't bring fireworks or grand declarations. It shows up in small preferences. I started noticing things again. The satisfaction of a well-structured argument, how each point builds cleanly into the next, how clarity feels almost physical in the body. The subtle psychological shift that comes from cleaning a desk completely instead of pushing clutter to the side. The posture change that happens when you finish something fully, not halfway, not adequately but completely. I hadn't realized how long I'd been operating at adequate. Adequate is safe. Adequate doesn't require risk. Adequate doesn't demand vision. But adequate also doesn't create momentum. When you've been surviving, you don't have room for aspiration. Survival consumes attention. It narrows focus to the immediate. It reduces your world to damage control. As stability strengthened, through therapy sessions, small boundaries, quiet endurance, space opened. At first, the space felt unfamiliar, empty. Then it began to feel like opportunity. In that space, a new question surfaced, one I hadn't asked honestly in years. What do I actually want? Not what looks impressive on paper, not what protects me from scrutiny, not what numbs discomfort. What feels aligned? The question unsettled me. I had spent so long reacting to pressure, to anxiety, to internal noise, that I wasn't used to initiating from preference. Choosing felt risky. I started small, saying no to a commitment that felt unnecessary instead of automatically agreeing to maintain reputation. Leaving an event earlier than expected because I was genuinely tired, not because I was trying to escape something. Speaking more directly in conversations instead of softening everything to preserve image. Each decision felt minor on the surface. but internally it reinforced something foundational. I am not obligated to continue patterns that shrink me. The return of desire didn't make me euphoric. It made me responsible. Because once you rediscover what matters to you, precision, integrity, growth, you can't convincingly pretend indifference anymore. Indifference had been my shield. If nothing truly mattered, nothing could truly hurt. If I didn't care deeply, I couldn't fail deeply. But indifference is expensive. It costs you the ability to build. Now, I was beginning to care again about the architecture of my life, about how my days were structured, about the quality of my work, about the direction of my relationships, about the tone of my own internal dialogue. Not to impress, not to escape, but to build something that didn't require concealment. There were still evenings where doubt visited, still moments where restlessness flickered. The past didn't vanish. The old impulses didn't evaporate. But the negotiation had changed. I was no longer negotiating with destruction. I was negotiating with growth. Growth is slower, less dramatic. It asks for consistency instead of intensity. And consistency, I was learning, is how desire becomes direction. One night, standing by the window of my apartment, I caught myself imagining the future. Not abstractly, not in vague outlines. Specifically. Projects I wanted to pursue, habits I wanted to solidify, relationships I wanted to strengthen, work I wanted to elevate. The future didn't feel like a threat. It didn't feel like a weight. It felt possible. And possibility, when it returns after a long absence, changes the way you stand. Your shoulders settle differently, your breath deepens, your decisions gain intention. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was preparing to build. Chapter 16. 2 names, 1 man. There was a time when I believed I would eventually have to choose. Choose between the version of me who sits at polished conference tables discussing procurement strategies and compliance matrices, and the version who stays awake past midnight, staring at a blinking cursor, writing about regret. Between structured proposals worth millions and sentences that cost me sleep. Between Khalid and KX. I used to think those identities were incompatible. That one had to be the respectable one, and the other the hidden one. Now I understand something I couldn't see back then. They were never opposites. They were fragments waiting to be integrated. By day, I enter rooms where numbers matter, where timelines are dissected, where a misplaced clause can disqualify months of work. There's a language to that world, measured, precise, outcome-driven. I've learned how to construct arguments that withstand scrutiny, how to turn complex technical frameworks into clean narratives, how to sit across from evaluators and present confidence without arrogance. There is discipline in that environment. Deadlines don't negotiate. Budgets don't respond to emotion. Compliance requirements don't bend because you had a difficult week. That world taught me structure. It taught me restraint. It taught me how to think in layers, technical, financial, operational, without losing coherence, and I respect it. But at night, the tone shifts. The laptop opens again, but the language changes. No KPIs, no submission portals, no evaluation criteria. Instead, memory. Instead, loneliness. Instead, the quiet aftermath of self-destruction. Instead, the fragile pride of rebuilding something from the inside out. When I write as KX, there are no boardrooms, no government frameworks, no revenue projections. There is vulnerability. There is exposure. There is the uncomfortable task of translating feelings into sentences without dramatizing them. For a long time, I thought these worlds contradicted each other. How can someone negotiate multi-million projects and also admit he once couldn't negotiate with his own impulses? How can someone manage 339 proposals and still confess he once couldn't manage himself? The question itself was rooted in shame. Shame assumes that professionalism and vulnerability cannot coexist. But they can. In fact, they feed each other. The same discipline that helped me rebuild my nervous system helps me rebuild client trust. The same attention to detail that saves a proposal from disqualification saved me from rationalizations that could have derailed recovery. The same patience required to navigate withdrawal is required to lead a team through uncertainty. There is no contradiction, there is integration. Yes, there are different names, different handles, different chapters. But aliases are no longer escapes, they are expressions. There was a time when usernames reflected confusion, irony, rebellion, defiance, versions of myself that leaned into fragmentation. Now, if someone reads my books and then searches my professional profile, they will find continuity, the same structured mind, the same reflective tone, the same deliberate pace, imperfect but aligned. I don't glamorize my past. Addiction wasn't poetic, it was destabilizing. It cost me education I had once valued. It strained relationships I still think about. It introduced a version of myself I barely recognized. It didn't make me interesting. It made me fractured. But it forced a confrontation most people postpone indefinitely. Who are you without your defenses? Recovery wasn't simply abstinence, it was alignment. Alignment between who I was publicly and who I was privately. Alignment between competence and honesty. Alignment between ambition and integrity. The projects I've helped secure, from digital transformation initiatives to behavioral insights labs, required resilience, focus, accountability. But the internal reconstruction required more. It required humility. It required admitting that intelligence does not immunize you against self-sabotage. It required understanding that success without self-respect feels hollow. There are still critics. There are still questions about visibility, about recognition, about whether someone can carry both a corporate resume and a confessional bibliography without contradiction. I don't control that. What I control is consistency. Showing up sober, showing up prepared, showing up honest. The boy who built silence to survive is gone. The man who fractured himself in search of relief survived. The man I am now is neither performance nor confession alone. He is integration. In meetings, I don't feel like I'm hiding a secret life. When I write, I don't feel like I'm betraying a professional identity. 2 names, 1 spine, 1 set of values. And this time I'm not splitting myself to survive. I'm standing whole. Chapter 17, Reputation. There's a strange shift that happens the first time you realize your name exists independently of you. Not in a grand, famous way, just searchable. You type it into a browser out of curiosity, and there it is. Corporate announcements, tender awards, project summaries, book listings, old usernames that cling to forgotten platforms, a digital trail stretching across years of evolution. Your name appears in rooms you're not in. Boardrooms, procurement portals, online bookstores, archived social media posts you barely remember writing. At first, that visibility unsettled me, not because I had something dramatic to hide, but because I knew my story wasn't linear. If someone dug deep enough, they'd find contradictions. An engineering student who didn't finish, a professional trusted with national-scale proposals who once couldn't regulate his own impulses, a writer speaking about redemption who had once sold poison to quiet his own chaos. For a long time, I was afraid of someone stitching those pieces together without context, afraid they would freeze me in one chapter, afraid they would reduce the complexity to hypocrisy. But over time, I began to understand something essential. Reputation isn't perfection. It's pattern. Anyone can have a collapse. Anyone can have a hidden chapter. Anyone can have a phase they regret. The real question is repetition. What do you repeat? If someone traces my pattern honestly, they will find disruption, yes, but they will also find correction. They'll find hundreds of proposals written and reviewed under pressure, dozens of awarded projects, millions secured across ministries, authorities, national initiatives, meetings where I was entrusted with strategy, deadlines met, teams coordinated, responsibilities carried without collapse. Those facts exist. They're documented. They matter. But the pattern I value most now is quieter. I show up sober. I show up accountable. I show up consistent. There was a time when I believed visibility meant validation. That being seen equaled being affirmed. Now I understand something heavier. Visibility means responsibility. If I speak about recovery, I must live it. If I write about discipline, I must practice it. If I lead projects worth millions, I must lead myself first. Reputation isn't built in declarations. It's built in repetition. There are debates about notability, about narrative, about whether telling your own story is self-promotion or self-documentation. Some assume visibility is ambition disguised. Some assume discipline is image management. I don't control those interpretations. I control conduct. My past includes aliases that reflected who I was becoming and who I was escaping. Some names were armor. Some were experiments. Some were cries for attention disguised as art. I don't disown them, but I don't hide behind them either. The man who once needed anonymity to survive now understands that identity isn't built through secrecy. It's built through coherence. When I step into a boardroom today, I'm not trying to outrun a former version of myself. When I publish under KX, I'm not rebelling against the corporate world. I'm integrating. When Saudi Azam earned Class A qualification, it was a corporate milestone, yes, a reflection of governance, operational maturity, technical readiness. But privately, it symbolized something else to me. Sustainability, structure, endurance. There was a time in my life when I burned everything I touched. Opportunities, trust, time. Now I build frameworks designed to last years. I draft strategies meant to withstand scrutiny. I lead processes that require precision and patience. That shift didn't happen through inspiration. It happened through repetition. Therapy sessions attended even when I felt fine. Nights endured without shortcuts. Conversations chosen over isolation. Impulses resisted. Reputation, I've learned, isn't about what people say about you in rooms you're not in. It's about what you consistently repeat when no one is watching. And I am no longer repeating destruction. I am repeating structure. I am repeating discipline. I am repeating alignment. If someone searches my name today, they will find complexity. Corporate milestones beside confessional writing, professional titles beside personal reflection, numbers beside narrative. That used to terrify me. Now it doesn't. Because complexity isn't contradiction. It's evidence of growth. And for the first time in my life, I don't need my story to look simple. I need it to be honest. Chapter 18. The Long Game. There was a time when my life was measured in hours. How do I get through tonight? How do I feel better now? How do I avoid consequences this week? My decisions were immediate, emotional, reactive, relief-driven. Now I think in years. That shift sounds simple when written in a sentence. It isn't. When you've burned enough bridges, academically, financially, emotionally, your brain adapts to urgency. It learns to prioritize the immediate reward, immediate relief, immediate validation, immediate escape. The nervous system becomes short-sighted. The long game requires retraining it, patience without applause, effort without instant reward, faith without guarantees. In bid management, you learn this lesson early. You can spend weeks structuring a proposal, aligning technical frameworks, refining compliance matrices, negotiating pricing models, reviewing risk registers, only to lose by a fraction of a point. You can build a document that is precise, compliant, and strategically sound, and still lose. At first, that used to frustrate me. Now I understand something fundamental. You don't control the outcome. You control the quality. That distinction reshaped more than my career. It reshaped my recovery. Sobriety is not dramatic anymore. It's procedural. It's waking up and choosing structure again. It's declining invitations that don't align with who I'm building. It's answering messages instead of disappearing when discomfort rises. It's reviewing contracts instead of reviewing regrets. No fireworks, just repetition. People quote numbers, hundreds of proposals, dozens of awarded projects, millions secured across ministries and national initiatives. But those numbers don't represent brilliance. They represent consistency. No single tender defines a company's reputation. Repetition does. The same applies to character. I used to think redemption was a moment, a turning point, a speech, a decision. It isn't. Redemption is maintenance. It's drafting a compliance section at midnight while remembering that 5 years ago I couldn't sit still without sabotaging something. It's mentoring someone younger on the team and recognizing my former impulsiveness in their impatience. It's being entrusted with strategy discussions tied to national programs and understanding the weight of that trust. Trust used to terrify me. When I was unstable internally, being trusted felt dangerous, like exposure waiting to happen. Now trust grounds me. It reminds me that consistency compounds. Yes, I write books. Yes, I speak openly about addiction. Yes, I've carried different names at different stages of my life. But the real shift isn't public. It's internal. I no longer chase intensity. I build stability. The long game is slower, less glamorous, sometimes boring. And boring, I've learned, is underrated. Boring means predictable sleep, predictable integrity, predictable growth. When Saudi Azam earned higher qualification status, it wasn't just about eligibility for larger government projects. It was about systems working as intended. Governance frameworks holding under pressure, processes scaling sustainably. It confirmed something I had begun to understand personally. When you build structure carefully, it scales. The same is true for a person. You build habits, you refine standards, you reinforce discipline, you repeat alignment. Over time, scale follows. Growth becomes less dramatic and more durable. There are still critics, still skeptics, still people who see only fragments of the story. That's fine. The long game doesn't argue loudly, it demonstrates. 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine leading complex bids tied to national initiatives. I couldn't imagine speaking about my own collapse without flinching. I couldn't imagine choosing patience over intensity. Now both worlds, corporate precision and personal reflection, exist inside the same week. That's the difference. Not a dramatic reinvention, a sustained direction. I don't measure my life by how far I've escaped my past. I measure it by how consistently I move forward without betraying myself. That's the long game. And for the first time in my life, I'm patient enough to play it. Chapter 19. The weight of my own name. There was a period when I preferred usernames to my own name, not because I was mysterious, because I was divided. One name carried the chaos, one name carried the ambition, one name carried the version of me that wanted to sound larger than life. KXN, names that felt sharper, louder, detached from consequence. They gave me room to experiment, to exaggerate, to confess indirectly, to build an identity without fully risking the one printed on official documents. But eventually, every alias feels small if you're still running. The problem was never visibility. It was ownership. For years, I filtered myself through a quiet question. Which version of me is acceptable? Acceptable to employers, acceptable to family, acceptable to readers, acceptable to strangers who might search my name. That question keeps you fragmented. At some point, it shifted. I stopped asking which version was acceptable. I started asking, which version is honest? That question doesn't simplify your life, it complicates it. Because honesty requires integration. Yes, I built a career in bid management. Yes, the numbers are real. Hundreds of proposals, dozens of awarded projects, millions secured across ministries and public entities. Technical acceptance rates, submission deadlines met, governance frameworks satisfied. Those facts exist because I chose structure over self-destruction repeatedly. But statistics don't show the internal negotiations that preceded. They don't show the nights when relapse felt easier than discipline. They don't show the mornings when shame tried to narrate my future before I could. They don't show the fear that someone in a boardroom would look at me too closely and detect the past in my posture. Addiction doesn't just rewire your body, it rewires your sense of worth. For a long time, I overcompensated professionally because I didn't believe I deserved stability. Achievement became armor. Productivity became penance. If I could outwork my history, maybe I could silence it. If I could build enough credibility, maybe it would cancel out what I had destroyed. But recovery forced something deeper than productivity. Self-forgiveness. And self-forgiveness is uncomfortable. It's easier to punish yourself quietly through overachievement than to genuinely accept that you were flawed and are still worthy of rebuilding. It meant acknowledging harm, not dramatizing it, not minimizing it, just acknowledging it. There were people I hurt, opportunities I burned, trust I fractured, versions of myself I abandoned. I cannot rewrite those chapters. No amount of awards or milestones erases them. But I can choose how the next ones are drafted. Writing under a pen name gave me space to practice honesty before I was ready to attach it fully to my legal identity. It was a buffer. Through memoir fragments and fictionalized truths, I learned to articulate what once controlled me. I learned to examine regret without collapsing under it. I learned to separate confession from performance. But eventually you outgrow protective layers. Now, when someone searches my name, they will find multiplicity. Corporate strategist. Author, former addict, mentor. All of it is accurate. What is no longer accurate is the assumption that these identities compete. They don't. The discipline that helps secure a multi-million contract is the same discipline that keeps me sober. The analytical mind that structures a compliance matrix is the same mind that dissects my own triggers. The resilience required to handle rejected bids mirrors the resilience required to handle cravings. Nothing is wasted, not even collapse. The darkness did not make me profound, but surviving it made me precise. The difference today is this. I don't glamorize what nearly dismantled me. I don't weaponize it for attention. I don't deny it either. It happened. and it doesn't get to define the direction anymore. There will always be skepticism, questions about visibility, conversations about legitimacy, assumptions about motive. That is part of existing publicly, even at a modest scale. But I no longer measure my worth by universal belief in my narrative. I measure it by consistency. I wake up, I work, I write, I mentor, I stay sober. No dramatic declarations, no reinventions every 6 months. Just continuity. The weight of my own name used to feel heavy. Now it feels earned. Not because it's flawless, but because I've learned to carry it without hiding behind anything else. Chapter 20. Integration. There was a version of me that believed success would erase history. If I won enough bids, if I secured enough contracts, if I built enough credibility in rooms that demanded precision, maybe the past would fade. Maybe addiction would shrink into something irrelevant. A phase, a footnote buried under achievements and LinkedIn endorsements. I thought results could outpace memory. They can't. History doesn't disappear, it integrates. For years, I treated my life like a set of compartments. Corporate performance in one box, polished, structured, defensible. Creative expression in another, vulnerable, reflective, anonymous when necessary. Addiction in a sealed container I hoped would never reopen. Tight lid. No oxygen. No discussion. But sealed things don't heal. They pressurize. And pressure finds its way out, through irritability, overcompensation, silent shame, defensiveness in moments that don't warrant it. Real growth didn't begin when I became successful. It began when I stopped trying to outrun the earlier chapters. When I stopped treating my past like an enemy and started examining it like data. Addiction taught me systems, even if they were destructive ones. It taught me how habits form around relief, how environments amplify behavior, how identity can shrink around a single obsession until everything else feels optional. It taught me how easy it is to rationalize small compromises. Just this once, just this week. No one will know. Those sentences built the architecture of collapse. Bid management taught me systems too, constructive ones. How structure reduces chaos, how timelines prevent drift, how compliance frameworks exist to catch weak points before they cost you everything, how clarity outperforms intensity. In proposals, ambiguity is expensive. Overconfidence is dangerous. Missing a single requirement can disqualify months of work. Writing became the bridge between those worlds. On paper, I could trace the architecture of my own collapse the way I would trace risk in a tender document. I could identify early cracks, ego disguised as confidence, escapism disguised as exploration, unprocessed pressure disguised as independence. I could see how small compromises stacked into larger consequences. That awareness now informs how I work. When I draft a proposal, I look for weak points early. Misalignment, ambiguity, assumptions not backed by evidence. Because I have lived what happens when small fractures go unchecked. Professionally, the metrics speak for themselves. Hundreds of submissions, dozens of awards, complex public sector projects tied to national transformation agendas, high-value contracts requiring coordination across technical, financial, and governance teams. But internally, the achievement I value most isn't a contract. It's coherence. I no longer feel like two separate men sharing one legal identity. I am the strategist who understands regulatory compliance and financial modeling. I am the writer who documents vulnerability without romanticizing it. I am the recovered addict who mentors quietly without preaching. None of these cancel the others. They reinforce each other. There are still moments of discomfort, when someone references the past casually, when visibility feels heavier than anonymity, when debates surface about legitimacy, narrative, recognition. But I've learned something essential. You don't build stability by defending your story constantly. You build it by living it consistently. The corporate world measures impact in revenue, deliverables, milestones. The recovery world measures it in days, honesty, restraint. The creative world measures it in resonance, whether words land where they're meant to. For a long time, I switched masks between those spaces. Now, I don't. That's new. Integration isn't dramatic, it doesn't trend, it doesn't announce itself with a speech. It feels like waking up without dread, like entering a high-stakes meeting without imposter syndrome screaming that you don't belong, like publishing a book without hiding behind irony or exaggerated darkness. It feels aligned. 5, 6, 7 years ago, survival was the objective. Don't collapse, don't get exposed, Don't lose everything. Today, sustainability is the objective. Build something that lasts. Protect your nervous system. Protect your integrity. Protect your direction. And sustainability requires something more mature than ambition. It requires wholeness. I am no longer trying to prove I've changed. I'm no longer trying to erase who I was. I'm no longer splitting myself into acceptable and unacceptable versions. I am simply living in a way that doesn't contradict itself. My work aligns with my values, my writing aligns with my lived experience, my discipline aligns with my recovery. That is integration, not perfection, not reinvention, wholeness. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel fragmented. I feel like one man moving in one direction, with all his chapters intact. Chapter 21. Legacy isn't loud. There was a time when I equated visibility with importance. If my name appeared in more places, it meant I mattered more. If the numbers grew, followers, views, mentions, it meant I was becoming significant. If a draft biography existed somewhere online, waiting for approval or review, it felt like proof that the story counted. Documentation felt like validation. But over time, I realized something uncomfortable. Documentation is not legacy. Analytics refresh, algorithms shift. Platforms rise and disappear. Attention is rented, not owned. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue for its own existence. It doesn't defend itself in comment sections. It lives in quieter places. It lives in the junior colleague who submits his first bid confidently because you stayed late correcting his compliance matrix without making him feel small. It lives in the recovering addict who sends a private message at midnight saying, "I was about to relapse. I remembered something you wrote." It lives in the client who trusts your proposal not because of branding, but because your structure feels dependable. That's impact, not headlines. Yes, I've built a measurable professional record, complex tenders, high-value projects, strategic wins tied to national programs and digital transformation initiatives. The numbers are traceable, the milestones documented. But what I care about now is pattern continuity. Did I respond with integrity when pressure increased? Did I stay sober when no one was watching? Did I deliver what I promised even when the margin was thin? Legacy, I've learned, is less about how widely your name spreads and more about how consistently your character holds. There were moments when I craved recognition to validate the transformation, when I believed public acknowledgement would confirm that recovery was real, that if enough people believe the arc, then it must be legitimate. It doesn't work that way. Recovery is real even if no one applauds it. Professional excellence is real even if no article summarizes it. Creative expression is real even if it reaches a modest audience. The metric that matters most is alignment. The man handling multi-million SAR contracts cannot be disconnected from the man who once nearly dismantled his own future. If I pretend those chapters are unrelated, I fracture myself again. Instead, I let them inform each other. The addict taught me consequences. The strategist taught me structure. The writer taught me reflection. Together, they shape judgment. There will always be debates about scale, whether a platform is large enough, whether a biography qualifies, whether a story is notable. I no longer live inside those debates. I live inside decisions. Wake up early, submit on time, tell the truth, mentor without announcing it, write without exaggerating, stay sober without broadcasting it daily. That repetition is the real architecture. If years from now someone reduces my life to a paragraph, they may list achievements. They may mention aliases. They may frame the arc from collapse to stability. But the truth will be simpler than any summary. He didn't quit on himself. He didn't repeat the same destruction. He chose structure when chaos felt easier. Legacy isn't about being known everywhere. It's about being reliable anywhere, in a boardroom, in a recovery circle, in a quiet apartment at night. Today I choose reliability over noise, consistency over spectacle, depth over volume, because the loudest lives aren't always the most enduring. And I'm no longer building for applause, I'm building for continuity. Chapter 22. The man in the middle. People prefer sharp arcs, the fall, the crash, the redemption, the triumph. They want clear chapters with obvious transitions. They want the before and the after, the headline and the resolution. But most of life is not lived in extremes. It's lived in the middle. And that's where I exist now. Not in the collapse, not in the applause, in the ordinary stretch between both. When people summarize my story, they gravitate toward the edges. They talk about the addiction years, the dealing, the academic failures, the financial damage, the nights that could have ended differently. Or they talk about the measurable achievements, hundreds of proposals, government projects, millions secured, certifications earned, qualification milestones reached. Both are true. Neither describes my Tuesday. Daily life is quieter. It's reviewing a compliance matrix at 10:30 p.m. and catching a minor requirement that could have disqualified weeks of work. It's responding thoughtfully to a junior colleague who's anxious about his first major submission. It's receiving a message from someone in early recovery and choosing to answer honestly instead of generically. It's ignoring an old impulse that still knocks occasionally, not loudly, not urgently, but familiarly. It's editing a paragraph until it feels true instead of impressive. There was a time when I felt pressure to choose which narrative to lead with. Corporate professional, recovered addict, emerging author. Each came with expectations. Each came with assumptions. But I've learned that peace doesn't come from curating the narrative. It comes from maintaining structure. I am not a headline. I am not a redemption arc. I am a man maintaining his alignment. Yes, I've used different names online. Some were shields, some were experiments. Some reflected phases I've outgrown. But identity isn't a username anymore. It's behavior. If I submit on time, if I prepare thoroughly, if I mentor responsibly, if I stay sober when no one is watching, if I resist exaggerating my story for attention, that is identity. There are always conversations about visibility. Is the platform large enough? Is the recognition organic? Does the biography qualify? I used to monitor those questions closely. Now I measure different things. Did the proposal make sense? Did the client trust the structure? Did the writing carry truth? Did I go to sleep without shame? That is my metric system. Addiction once narrowed my world to survival and sensation. Recovery expanded it to responsibility. Professional growth refined it into discipline. Writing softened it with reflection. All of those elements coexist now. None dominate. I don't wake up thinking about legacy. I don't wake up thinking about controversy. I don't wake up checking whether the internet has validated me. I wake up thinking, what needs to be done today? Which commitments require attention? Where does integrity need reinforcement? There is something deeply stabilizing about that. The man in the middle doesn't need to be extreme. He needs to be consistent. He understands that redemption is not a trophy you display. It's a pattern you maintain. He understands that success is not immunity. It's responsibility. He understands that creativity is not escape. It's integration in motion. I am no longer trying to escape my past. I am no longer trying to outshine. No, I am building forward, structurally, deliberately. Not to prove anything, not to silence critics, not to dramatize growth, just to remain aligned. For the first time in my life, the middle doesn't feel like a compromise. It feels like stability. And stability, I've learned, is enough. Chapter 23. Quiet authority. Power once unsettled me. Not volume, not hierarchy, not impressive job titles. Composure. The steady presence that enters a room without announcing itself. The person who speaks once and shifts the direction of discussion. The individual whose silence carries weight. I used to compensate for insecurity with excess. Too many explanations, too much energy, too many justifications. Each milestone felt like repayment for an invisible debt. Every achievement attempted to neutralize history. Productivity became a defense strategy. Operating from guilt drains you. You perform instead of contribute. That posture eventually collapsed. The shift didn't come from forgetting the past. It came from refusing to treat memory like a prosecution. I am not defending myself anymore. In strategic discussions today, I don't scan faces for suspicion. I don't brace for exposure. Preparation replaces anxiety. Experience replaces posturing. I understand scope breakdowns. I recognize structural risk. I know how evaluation committees think. I anticipate compliance gaps before they appear. That steadiness isn't ego. It's repetition layered over time. Large volumes of submissions teach cadence. Awarded contracts refine positioning. Rejected tenders cultivate discernment. Failure becomes instruction instead of identity. Substance once simulated dominance. Chemicals offered counterfeit certainty. That version of control was aggressive, inflated, unstable. Rehabilitation introduced something different. Containment. Containment means pausing before reacting. It means resisting exaggeration. It means declining theatrics when simplicity suffices. It means presenting results without embellishment. It means declining to monetize wounds for applause. This is where I stand now. There are always conversations surrounding exposure, recognition, reach, influence. Public stories invite commentary. I no longer pursue affirmation to quiet insecurity. I pursue accuracy. Does the financial structure reinforce the technical narrative? Did the proposal anticipate evaluation criteria thoroughly? Did I guide a junior colleague without projecting unresolved fragments of myself onto him? That is leadership, not dominance, not spectacle. Capability aligned with principle. Creative work matured as well. Initially, writing functioned as release, raw, urgent, eager for understanding. Now it resembles craftsmanship, deliberate, controlled, intentional. Pain does not require amplification to hold truth. Acknowledgement suffices. I once imagined transformation would feel cinematic, a dramatic rebirth, a visible shift. Instead, it feels steady. It feels like using my legal name without hesitation in every setting. It feels like no longer needing alternate identities to navigate pressure. It feels like understanding that credibility grows through continuity, not reinvention. Subtle influence lacks glamour. It does not trend, yet it endures. I don't aim to dominate discussions. I aim to anchor them. Reliability outlasts volume, and steadiness, cultivated over years, carries more weight than noise ever could. Chapter 24. The cost of becoming transformation demands payment, not only in currency, though that toll arrived as well. The heavier invoice arrived internally. Maturity carries a subtle mourning. When steadiness enters your life, certain former identities quietly disappear, old circles fade, familiar atmospheres lose their appeal. What once felt like oxygen begins to suffocate. Around 2015, acceleration defined my existence. Movement felt exhilarating while deterioration unfolded underneath. Quick cash, dangerous shortcuts, chemical relief. I framed recklessness as autonomy. Dependency rarely introduces itself as ruin. It presents itself as comfort. By the time awareness surfaced, lost academic direction, fractured credibility, eroded trust, strained intimacy, I had constructed an existence centered on concealment. Concealing routines, concealing liabilities, concealing truth from those who still believed in my potential. The deepest low point wasn't monetary, it was relational. Watching affection withdraw because disorder consumed too much space. Observing opportunity vanish because dependability dissolved. Hearing promises leave my own mouth while recognizing their emptiness. Treatment did not feel triumphant. It felt stripping. Detox dismantles ego. Counseling dismantles denial. Circle discussions dismantle isolation. You sit among strangers and realize your trajectory is not unique. It is patterned. That realization liberated me. Patterns can be interrupted. Rehabilitation did not deliver prosperity. It imposed accountability. From 2018 forward, Reconstruction occurred. Freelance technical drafting, long evenings refining compliance language, immersing myself in procurement systems across Saudi Arabia and Egypt, studying transformation frameworks tied to national agendas. No celebration marked that chapter, only repetition. Consistency compounds. Hundreds of structured submissions, strong technical evaluations, numerous awarded contracts spanning artificial intelligence, behavioral research, infrastructure, healthcare, digital ecosystems. Metrics tell part of the narrative. Durability tells the rest. Managing nearly 200 bids with disciplined timelines does not require brilliance. It requires frameworks, calendars, verification lists, risk mapping, pricing precision, cross-functional coordination, judgment regarding when to advance and when to recalibrate. That philosophy grew directly from healing. Chaos flourishes without systems. Tender strategy thrives on them. There is a quiet irony there. The analytical thinking once misused for concealment now strengthens compliance. The meticulous planning once directed toward harmful routes now structures lawful frameworks. Even missteps carried instruction. Simultaneously, language returned. Under KX, fragments emerged, not as spectacle, not as performance, but as record. Dissent. Isolation. Reconstruction. The gradual understanding that renewal is procedural rather than theatrical. Some observers question visibility, they question legitimacy, they question intent, doubt. Digital spaces complicate sincerity. Still, my motive is not admiration. Silence once nearly destroyed me. Now articulation preserves clarity. Present-day life contains layers, strategic planning during daylight hours, reflective writing after dark, private guidance offered without audience metrics. I reside in Egypt. My professional responsibilities cross borders. Some rooms demand exactness. Other spaces require openness. The price of becoming this version of myself was significant. Lost time, damaged connections, humiliation metabolized. Yet the return surpasses prior gains, security without concealment. I no longer require disorder to feel stimulated. I no longer require alternate identities to feel strong. I no longer require intensity to feel relevant. Evolution lacks glamour. It requires endurance. It unfolds. At times it isolates, yet it is authentic. And authenticity, once earned, outweighs spectacle. Chapter 25. Between exposure and privacy. Visibility carries a particular tension when something sacred must remain protected. My identity is searchable across platforms and professional networks. Positions appear alongside contracts, statistics, and digital traces that connect years which once felt fragmented. Even chapters I hoped would dissolve remain archived somewhere in the background of the internet. However, search engines cannot index discernment. They do not display restraint. They cannot measure the moments when silence is chosen intentionally, rather than imposed by fear. There was a period when oversharing felt necessary. Instability disguised itself as authenticity, and volume replaced reflection. Speaking constantly prevented solitude and distracted me from confronting myself. Later, concealment took over. Withdrawal felt safer than transparency. Shame convinced me that invisibility offered protection. I hid not to preserve dignity, but to avoid facing the weight of my own history. Neither extreme created balance. Eventually, selection replaced reaction. I began choosing what to express and what to protect. I've addressed dependency, distribution, academic derailment, and relationships strained under pressure. I have acknowledged harm and admitted failure without ornamenting either. The purpose was not spectacle, but proportion. Concealed truth expands. Named truth contracts. Maturity introduced another principle. Not every detail belongs in public view. Corporate environments reinforced lessons first encountered during recovery. High-level tender evaluations demand preparation, documentation, and composure. Confidentiality forms the backbone of credibility. Boundaries safeguard trust. Emotional exposure has its place, but not everywhere. That discipline reshaped how I narrate my own experience. Certain conversations remain within therapeutic rooms. Letters written during fragile moments were designed for healing rather than publication. Some memories belong to those who stood beside me at the time, not to distant observers. Awareness emerged through rehabilitation. Limit setting developed through professional growth. Together, they created equilibrium. Speculation around visibility continues. Momentum is questioned. Platform growth is scrutinized. Dual identities invite interpretation. Perception varies, and it always will. Some detect inconsistency, others infer ambition. A few assume calculation, progression. Within Egyptian culture, identity carries nuance. Family lineage holds significance. Reputation travels through relationships rather than headlines. Delivery builds credibility more effectively than announcements ever could. Operating within Saudi governmental frameworks intensifies that expectation. Precision becomes mandatory. Minor oversight risks disqualification. Financial misalignment erodes trust. Managing extensive submissions reshapes cognition. Compliance matrices demand vigilance. Evaluation criteria require anticipation. Stakeholder coordination calls for foresight. Such environments cultivate discipline that extends beyond motivation. When professional obligations conclude, writing begins. Under KX, there is no escape. There is integration. Memory is examined without glamour. Redemption is explored without theatrics. Duality is acknowledged without fragmentation. Creative work serves consolidation rather than promotion. Earlier usernames reflected confusion and youthful projection. They represented experimentation and detachment. Erasure would deny history. Contextualization gives it meaning. Evolution is placement rather than deletion. Present life favors steadiness. Guidance is offered. Preparation is executed thoroughly. Prose is crafted deliberately. Sobriety is practiced without daily announcement. Predictability now carries strength. Exposure once felt threatening. Privacy once felt defensive. Both are now deliberate choices rather than reflexive reactions. Proof of change no longer requires performance. Continuity communicates more effectively than proclamation. Former disorder yielded to scheduling. Raw confession matured into revision. Fear of scrutiny transformed into readiness for evaluation. Instead of choosing between revelation and reserve, balance emerged. Balance sustains longevity. The narrative slows here not from exhaustion, but because amplification is unnecessary. One final chapter remains. No justification is required. No persuasion is intended. Only presence remains, steady, integrated, and unfragmented, standing without explanation. Chapter 26. From above, I did not leave this world young. That alone was mercy. There was a period when another outcome felt likely. Nights stretched into morning without intention. Substances moved through my bloodstream like counterfeit bravery. Choices carried no concern for consequence. Tomorrow seemed optional. The horizon felt disposable. Had my life ended during that era, the conclusion would have been disorderly. Apologies would have remained suspended. Conversations unfinished. My identity permanently fused to its most destructive chapter. That is not how it unfolded. I remained long enough to outgrow the man who was dissolving himself. From this vantage point, removed from urgency and ambition, I see the end with clarity. My final day contained no spectacle, no cinematic farewell, no dramatic irony. It was ordinary. By then, living had become intentional. Routines once unimaginable had solidified. Early mornings replaced scattered nights. Structured agendas replaced impulsive decisions. Preparation replaced recklessness. Stability replaced volatility. Predictability, once feared, became comforting. From above, milestones blur while smaller gestures sharpen. Messages answered before deadlines, budgets reviewed with care, documents refined with patience, evenings spent writing not to escape, but to understand. Encouragement offered to someone wrestling the battles I once fought. Those moments carried more weight than public accomplishments. My departure did not ripple across continents. It did not trend across platforms. It did not command spectacle. It shifted something quieter. I watched news travel through Cairo by voice rather than headline. Family gathered in familiar spaces. Neighbors stepped inside. Colleagues composed brief, thoughtful notes. They described steadiness. They described dependability. They described change. They described assistance. No one cited statistics. No one referenced platforms. No one analyzed visibility. They remembered presence. From this height, perspective simplifies truth. Influence settles into intimate spaces. It does not expand infinitely. It anchors itself in individual memory. A teammate recalled composure under pressure. A junior colleague remembered clarity offered during complexity. Someone from recovery circles summarized everything in 3 words that carried extraordinary weight. He remained sober. That statement echoed longer than any award. My books continue existing in digital libraries. Strangers may highlight sentences without knowing the labor behind them. Some will close those pages without ceremony. That is acceptable. Creation was never about immortality. It was about coherence. Seen from here, my existence forms a continuous arc. Recklessness, reconstruction, discipline, steadiness. Each segment connects without contradiction. Nothing competes anymore, everything contributes. Death did not erase history, it sealed it. There are no further revisions, no additional drafts, no new defenses. The narrative rests complete, imperfect, unexceptional in scale, yet aligned. I once feared departing as the worst version of myself. That fear did not materialize. I concluded as someone who learned restraint. As someone who repaired what he could. As someone who chose continuity over chaos. Looking downward, I no longer see fragmentation. I see pattern. Noise has faded. Ambition has softened. Arguments about recognition hold no relevance. What remains is simple. I caused damage. I sought repair. I constructed stability. I endured. From this vantage point, one truth becomes undeniable. A steady, consistent life carries more strength than a loud, unfinished one. That realization is victory. And here at last there is peace, the end.